Now, there's this trend out there to fight against Afrocentrism. If you listen to my recent video where I reviewed the idea of whether or not Afrocentrists are toxic, you can see very clearly that most people have a completely false idea about what Afrocentrism is. A lot of times when they're criticizing Afrocentrism, they'll actually criticize ideas from individuals and entities who hate Africa and African identity. And we went over the Moors, the Hebrew Israelites, Aborigines, the space aliens, etc., etc. But a deeper issue among many of those who advocate for, pro-black conscious ideology or organizational methodology, or people who are interested in black identity politics, if you will, or black identity historical research, if you will, is West Afrikan Nationalism. And I specifically call it West Afrikan Nationalist Kemetology, because a lot of these people are maskers in the sense that they utilize inferences rooted in self-hatred, and then they try to pass them off as pro-black or pro-African. And it's completely ludicrous, because when you examine the methodology of these individuals, it's always incredibly flawed. These individuals don't even understand many of the mainstream methodologies used by academics in the field of Africana studies. Now, there's a serious problem when you have a Eurocentric depiction of what African people and African civilizations represent. There's also a serious problem when you have individuals of African descent who are utilizing methodologies that come from the West to analyze Africa. One of the main ones is Aristotelian logic, or the idea that truth and falsehood comes from either or propositions, as opposed to both and propositions that are rooted in context-dependent circumstances. A lot of individuals will say there is no such thing as African science, and there's one universal Western science. Now, this couldn't be any further from the truth, because when you analyze the history of science in Africa and in Europe, what you're going to find is that magic or metaphysics are the foundational propositions and inferences that are utilized within the development of science and falsified and validated according to the formal systems or customary systems of logic that exist within a culture or civilization. So anybody who's trying to tell you that African science is invalid or African science is inferior to this type of, universal science, which is really Western science, they are practicing self-hatred, especially if they come from a African heritage. This is absolutely 100% false. You see, science is the application of logical inferences to ascertain knowledge, under a specific methodology. You've had many different, philosophers of science who have tried to come up with a methodology to determine what scientific methods are. And they're mainly pulling from a philosophical perspective. This is where African philosophy comes in, because African philosophers have always practiced what's called harmonious monism, or a unity between all that can be seen, felt, and thought of. And you can't really utilize a Western perspective of constantly finding dualities, constantly finding oppositions or contradictions, and use that to understand the African experience. It just doesn't work that way. So when you're looking at a lot of these individuals, usually they are opposed to Africana studies. They're opposed to the different methodologies like historical comparative linguistics. They're opposed to just the different multivariate methods of archaeology that have been rooted within the study of classical African civilizations. They throw away certain inferences solely because they may use an Abrahamic text as a foundation of the proposition without actually verifying if their methodology and if the application of that methodology within the research process is correct. And this is kind of the problem when you don't have a structure, when you don't have a system of scientific development. If you're just out there basically playing the role of a universalist and trying to paint white and Western concepts black, you're never going to find the answer. You can't understand the history of West Africa without understanding its ancestry in the East. All human civilizations come from the East. And as I explained in my last video, when you look at the material evidence in archaeology or the archaeological cultures, such as the early Stone Age, the Middle Stone Age to the Late Stone Age, what you're going to find is it originates in the East, on the eastern part of the African continent, and then it slowly but surely reaches the West. Now, this is not an advocacy of diffusionism or migrationism, because those are monocausal archaeological inferences, when in reality, what we in Africana studies use is a multidisciplinary methodology or a pluridisciplinary methodology, where we corroborate different pieces of information within the different fields of knowledge, be it linguistics, archaeology, architecture, philosophy, theology, etc., etc. And by doing this, we can reconstruct accurate historical models. Those people who are tribalist and who are solely rooted in, be it a West African identity or even an East African identity, they are not rooted in the truth, and they are not practicing a rigid methodology. So if you see anybody who says there is no connection between ancient Kemet and West Africa, and they can't even tell you the first thing about historical comparative linguistics, or they use debunked methodologies like the multilateral comparative method, or what's called mass comparison, the usage of lexicostatistics or glottochronology on their own, these people don't know what they're talking about. If you see anybody who uses ethnoarchaeology as a way to identify the producers of certain material cultures, throughout history, that is completely invalid. Ethnoarchaeology is not an adequate tool to use in the field of historical archaeology with respect to determining the production context of specific material industries and material cultures, as well as being able to identify the ethnicity of the original creators and establishers of these cultures. Another thing that should be mentioned is that culture could be borrowed. Just because you find cultural correspondences doesn't necessarily mean that you have found the originators of that particular culture from a genetic perspective. So all that I'm saying is that it's necessary to have science in the discovery process of our knowledge and of our historical African civilizations. I would never trust anybody who's promoting any type of West African supremacy or promoting the idea that diasporans are solely West African, because that was even debunked within Holloway's Africanisms in North America. The Africanisms are not West Africanisms, they're Africanisms rooted in the totality of the continental African experience. And with that, I'll sign off and I'll see you on the next one.